So we ended the Gemara yesterday with someone intending to throw something in a public domain and into the public domain, but his intention was to throw it beyond a certain space. So we know that whatever his intention is always going to define the malacha. This person intended to threw it from a private domain into a public domain, but it went beyond right into the Rishus HaRabim, into the public domain. It went 4 amos further. Now we know that somebody carries within a public domain, within a Rishus HaRabim, 4 amos in and of itself is a malacha. So this person now has a double malacha. He carried from private domain into public domain, and also from the public domain 4 amos within there. Now, but it didn't land immediately as it came into the public domain. He threw it and it landed 4 amos beyond the public, beyond that into the public domain. And so here we're going to get into a question of kluta, which is the concept of once it's in the airspace of a Rishus HaRabim, does it count as if it landed there? And it would count as a havara and hitzah and havara, taking it out and transferring it beyond the 4 amos. So Gemara said there must be 2 obligations there, according to Rabbi Yehuda, who says more than the Chachamim, because the Chachamim are going to have to say at least one transgression. The one transgression being carrying from the private to the public, from Rishus HaYachid to Rishus HaRabim. So they're going to have to say at least that much. And therefore, when Rabbi Yehuda says an additional prohibition, chayiv, that is obligated, it means obligated another obligation. One for carrying from the private domain to public, and one carrying another 4 amos within the public. And the obligation is where did it land in between? He threw it out of the private domain into the public domain, and as soon as it crossed the line, it's in the airspace of the public domain. So it's as if it landed there, and then it continued on for another 4 amos. So that it tells us that it carried, he carried it within the public domain. So the Gemara says no. Actually, the Rabbanan would actually hold that in such a case it's completely exempt from a chatas offering, and he did not transgress the Torah prohibition of carrying. And the Chacham and Rabbi Yehuda says you're only obligated for one. What's the case? Where his intention was, and his express intention was, he wanted it to land immediately outside of his private domain into the public domain. So his intent was to take it from a private domain and toss it where it would land immediately outside of his space. But it continued on beyond that. So the Chachamim are going to say he's exempt because it wasn't Melechas Machshavas, it wasn't where he intended or the intended work. And Rabbi Yehuda says, even though that it continued on, but since halachically it's as if it landed immediately where the public domain began, because there's a kluta, this concept of that when it's absorbed in the public space, it's as if it landed in that space. So even though it continued on physically, but halachically, it's as if it landed immediately. And that's where we ended yesterday. And so this is about 10, 12 lines down on 97b, Tzadei Zayin on the base. Rabbi Yehuda only says that there's one obligation. And indeed, the Chachamim are going to be entirely exempting this person from mechatas. And what would be the case? Why would he not at least be chayiv for transferring it from the private domain to the public domain from Rishus HaYachid to Rishus HaRabim? Kegoyin, the Amar ad the nafkile l'Rishus HaRabim tenuach, where he says explicitly that he wants it to land immediately as it leaves the private domain into the public domain. This is the basis of machlokes Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says that we say kluta, and therefore his intent happened even though not physically, but halachically his intent happened because it's as if it landed immediately as it came into the private domain, public domain. The Chachamim say that we don't say that it's as if it landed immediately. But perhaps this concept that we began, that there would be two obligations, one for carrying across the public domain, and one for taking from private to public, when he threw it from the private and it went 4 amos into the public, he would not be obligated to. And why not? Because Rabbi Yehuda would concur with the Chachamim that said that if somebody does the principal prohibition, a subcategory will not obligate you in a separate chatas. Lo saikal. So Gemara says, no, we're not going to stick with that, with this interpretation, because it doesn't fit elsewhere. The Tani we learned Rabbi Yehuda Moisef, Rabbi Yehuda adds to the list of the 40 of the 39 melachas, so 40 minus 1 of the melachas. He adds afa shovet v'amadaktik. Shovet is somebody who takes while setting up the loom. Takes a pick to separate the threads from each other. A madaktik is also somebody who tightens them in order for it to be the loom to be tight. And amruloi, and they were chachamim said to him, shovet b'chal mesach. The shovet, this separating of the threads, is included in setting up the loom. And madaktik are b'chal orik, and separating the vertical lines as a part of weaving. In any case, so the Chachamim disagreed in the number, and Rabbi Yehuda said these are included as principles, and the Chachamim disagreed. So my love, wouldn't you say that the case is that somebody did both setting up the loom and mesach? He set up the loom and he spread the threads or stretched the threads, tightened it. Either way, he did both the principal and the secondary. I told them the reason Rabbi Yehuda counts these secondaries is because he says you're obligated for them in a chatas, even though that you did the principal, you set up the loom, and nevertheless, you're going to be chayiv even for the secondary acts within it. The Gemara says, maybe he did each one separately. Rabbi Yehuda told him, and he would agree that if you did the tolda, the secondary melacha, within the principal melacha, that you would not be obligated in a separate chatas. That would be included in the principal chatas. And rather, Rabbi Yehuda is classifying these as separate av malachas, just as we see that setting up the loom and setting up the vertical lines, and weaving itself. There are several of the 39 malachas that are a part of setting up the loom. So Rabbi Yehuda just has another 2 within the process of setting up the loom. Rabbanan Sabri Hani told us, and the Rabbanan say no, these are not. These are simply secondary. Teda, and I could prove to you that it's not that Rabbi Yehuda considers them secondary, but yet obligates you in a separate chatas, but rather that he just considers them their independent av malacha. The Torah of Yehuda Moisif, because as it says in the Brisa, it says Rabbi Yehuda adds, meaning he adds to the 39 malachas. He has a count of 41. Yamas b'shloma avos. If you say that they're counted as principles, so it makes sense. My Moisif avos. That's what it means that he adds them as principles, principal categories. Ella Amris told us, but if he's saying that it's a secondary, my Moisif, what did he add? There are plenty of secondary told us within the 39 malachas. So the Chachamim say that no, indeed Rabbi Yehuda. So the Gemara is saying indeed Rabbi Yehuda would hold that, like the Chachamim, that principles. Once you're obligated on the principle for a chatas, even if you did along with it some of the secondary, somebody that told us that you would not bring a separate chatas for it. And even though the Rabbi Yehuda and even though Rabbi Yehuda added some aspects to setting up the loom, those would be included in the avos and not secondaries. They're not told us. So taking back to our question, when Rabbi Yehuda said that somebody's chayiv for throwing something from a rishus hayachid to rishus harabim, private domain to public domain, and it continues 4 amos in the public domain, that he'd be chayiv does not mean chayiv twice, but chayiv once. Itmar nami. Indeed, it was said that Rabbi Yehuda only obligated one obligation, and what it means is it doesn't mean that he's obligated 2 chatais, one for carrying from the private domain to the public domain, throwing it out, and then another one for it traveling within another 4 amos. Rather, he's chayiv once, and the Chachamim are totally exempting, as we said before, because his intent did not come to fruition. Well, okay, great. So Ravina said to Rav Ashi, I'll accept that, but in the initial attempt to understand Rabbi Yehuda, we were willing to say that Rabbi Yehuda would obligate twice, 2 chatases, one for carrying from Rishus HaYachid to Rishus HaRabim, and one for carrying 4 amos within the Rishus HaRabim. What was his intent? As we said, in order to be chayiv, your intent has to have to come to fruition. What was his intent? That it should land immediately as it came into public domain? Well, it didn't. It went further. And if his intent was for it to go further, then why is he chayiv for landing immediately in public domain? So Gemara says you're right. In that explanation, which is not the way it is in the end anyhow, but we would have had to explain that his intention was that he wants to go anywhere, just as long as it goes into the public domain. It can land anywhere as long as it goes to public domain, and therefore he would have been chayiv. It would have been obligated on account of it going both into the public domain from the private. So that's taking out from private to public, and also ha'avara b'toich rishus harabim daled amos, carrying it within the public domain 4 amos. So Gemara now goes into this idea of intentionality in carrying. Pshita, it is obvious. If somebody intended to throw something 8 amos away, so he wants to throw something, say, 12 feet, and it only went 6 feet thus far. But that's part of the malacha has already been done, since every 4 amos is carrying in a public domain, and part of it got done. So even though it didn't complete his work, but part of his intention is there, and that's like writing half a word that is a word that's going to count as a malacha. That's like writing the word shame from the word shema. However, if it went farther than he wanted, so there you can't say at least part of it counts because it went beyond. Do we say, look, he carried it 4, just it went beyond? It didn't land where he wanted. The Amalei Ravina Ravashi, is this not what Ravina said to Ravashi? That it could be that he said wherever he wants it to fall. So we see that if it goes beyond, if it goes beyond, it would not count on account of, if it went short, it also wouldn't count because it wasn't where he wanted. It always has to be that landed where he wanted. And even though you said at the Kamas Arei Kasav Shem Shimon that at least part of the work that he part of his intent got done. Meaning, if I wrote half a word, which equals a word, so let's say I wrote cat out of category or something like that, and it would count as a word, Shem Mishimon, there I actually wrote something, right? Midami Hasam Kamadali Kasav Shem Lemichtav Leshimon, because you cannot write the word Shimon without first writing the first two letters. So it's a part of the process. Whereas when he intended to throw it in one throw to 8 feet, so the fact that he threw it halfway is not halfway there, it's totally not done. For Rick, if this is if you're trying to throw from shortstop to first and you threw halfway, you didn't get it there, right? It didn't get to where you needed to go. Tana Rabban. Azurik Nurshus Arabim Nurshus Arabim Nurshus Ayachad Bemtza. We had this case before. Somebody throws from a public domain to a public domain. So two public thoroughfares that are parallel to each other, let's assume. And in between, there's a house, a private domain enclosed. So Dalet Amos Chayev. If it's 4 Amos, then it's Chayev. If it goes beyond the public domain, meaning in the total of the public domain was 4 Amos, even though that there was a house in between, it will not break it. It means that we would count, let's say, 2 Amos of the public domain before it went through the house, and then on the other side, it went in the public domain another 2 Amos. It would combine. And now we're on Tzaddik Ches Amud Aleph. Pachas Ma'arba Amos Potter.
Didn't we say we consider the house to be completely full?
And Rebbe holds that the house is completely full and that it counts as if it landed in there. Correct. This is saying that we would count the public domains as a full 4 Amos, and they would combine. Now, the Pachas Ma'arba Amos Potter, but if it traveled less than 4 Amos in the public domain, then it's going to be exempt. Maika Mashmalan, what's the Chiddush here? Hakamashmalan, Rishuyas Mitzdarfus. 2 ideas. One, that the public domain could combine, even though that it went in between, even though that it went through a non-public domain in between, it'll count. So if somebody threw something 20 feet, it went, but 6 of those feet, let's say 4 Amos, of them are through a public domain. 2 aspects of public domain, 2 different public domains. Nevertheless, it's going to combine in order to have the requisite amount. And Rashi points out this is not like Rabbi Yossi earlier on Daf Pei, 20 Daf ago, where 18 Daf ago, where he says that it must be one rishus, one domain, and it can't go to another domain in between. And another thing it teaches us, and it says that when it's absorbed in the public domain, it counts as it's landed in the public domain. Amar Shmuel Rabbi Yehuda. The Gemara is going to explain now some of the aspects of public domain related to the wagons and the deconstruction of the Mishkan, where the beams coming down will put on those wagons. Amar Shmuel Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Rabbi, Amar Huna, Amar Rav. A public domain that has a ceiling, if you carry in there, you're going to be exempt. So, for instance, if you have a public domain and you have a bridge over it, you have a public domain, you have any structure over it, it would be exempt. In fact, if it has a porch over it, so even though it's a public domain, but a building has a porch protruding over it, carrying within that porch or the public domain around there would not count directly beneath any covering. Because it's not like the traveling in the midbar. The traveling in the midbar, which is the public domain, that was the Levite camp, the Machane Levia between Am Yisrael and Am Yisrael's encampment and the Mishkan. There, the traveling was in an open area. So Gemara says, "Eini, it's not so." V'ha'agalos the mekuras havion. Well, by the wagons, it was also, it had a ceiling, and the Gemara is going to explain that by the wagons, the ceiling was there. How do we know that there was a ceiling? On account of the way the wagons were situated. So as we mentioned the other day, as they were taking down the Mishkan, they had 4 wagons in rows of two wide, and the wagons themselves were 5 amos long, and the support beams in the wagons were 2.5 amos wide, and then the wheels and the beams themselves were another 1.5 on each side, 1.25 on each side, totaling again 5 amos. So we had a 5x5 square wagon. It was actually a rectangular wagon because the center point where the supports were was 2.5 wide by 5 long, but including the wheels, it ended up 5x5. Now, the beams themselves are 10 amos long, and they were perpendicular to the length of the wagon. So what ended up happening is that you had the wagon totaling 5 wide, and the beams were on these wagons with 2.5 amos sticking out on either side beyond the wheels, and they were piled 12. There were 12 beams per wagon. So Gemara says, "Amar Rav, Mishum Reb Chia, Agolos, these wagons, Tachtein, what was beneath it, Ubeineim, and between them, Vitzideim, and on their sides, meaning the sides of the wheels. Rishus Harabim, was all part of the public domain. So how can you tell me something that's covered is not a public domain and there's no prohibition of carrying there? Well, the wagons where we're learning the public domain from actually were essentially covered by the beams. Kikama Rav Bidarata. Rav is talking about the space between the beams. So the Gemara now is assuming that these beams were actually, and the Gemara is going to explain this a little more in depth. So just an introduction here, the beams were 1.5 amos by 1. So they were a 1 by 1.5 amma. An amma being, let's say, 18 inches. So they were 18 inches wide, and 26 inches long, and 10 amos tall. So let's say 15 feet tall. The Gemara at this point is assuming that, as you would do in a normal way, if you have a 5 amma wagon, so you're going to lay 3 piles of these beams on their side, meaning on their wider side. So it's 1.5 amma wide, and so they were laying on their side, on the 25-inch side, and so that would equal, since it's 1.5 amma, 1.5 amma, 1.5 amma, so that's 4.5 amos. So they have a half amma space in between them, divided between the 2 slots, between 2 spaces. So you have 3 piles of 4 beams high for the 12 beams on that wagon, and you'd have 1.5 amma of space with a 1/4 amma space, and then a 1.5 amma of beam, and a 1/4 amma space, a 1.5 amma of beam. So the air space between these beams is the space that we're talking about now that would be uncovered, and there would be public domain uncovered. Now, the Gemara is going to say that we have the concept of that a little space like that, if it's not 3 tefachim, is not going to count, and 3 tefachim is a half a amma. So this, at least a half amma, could be a little more. If the amma is 5 tefachim, it's going to be more than a half amma. But this is only a 1/4 amma space in between, so that would be lavud. It would be, as we saw yesterday, the concept that when you have less than 3 tefachim between a space, that gap doesn't count halachically. So mechti or kedai agala kama hava chamisham. The length of the wagon was 5 amma long. Put you the keresh kamahave, the width of the beam, how much is that? Amso palga, 1.5 amma. Kama maisiv tlasa, you can put down 3 beams, which would equal 4.5 ammas. So you're left with a half amma on the wagon. Divide that in half, meaning a quarter between each one of the piles. Partially palga, the amsa, all you're left with a half amma. Kishadule mar beni de beni. If you put them between the beams, kulavadami, it's going to be within the loved space. Gemara says, "Misav is crushing. Put you ave manachlu." You think that they were on their wide side? No, actually, achuda manachlu. They were on their narrow side, meaning that these beams were on their narrow side because they were only 4 an amma on the narrow side, and so they made 4 piles on the narrow side, 3 high, and the airspace between is now 3 gaps between them, of each one 1/3 of an amma. So what's remaining after each one? The narrow side of the beams is actually 1 amma. So kama hava moisiv, if you have a wagon of 5 ammas, you're going to be able to put 4 beams there with 3 gaps between them, each one being 1/3 of an amma. So you have an extra amma. If you put them in between, it's still going to be 1/3 of an amma. Is still going to be within the 3 tvachim of lava. And when it says Hanich lamana mekrashim lamatan ovia, amma melamalan kalan maholchin ad keetzba shaper. However, the Gemara says, if you follow Rabbi the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, we'll see soon, who says that these beams were not completely the same. They were not just the way we would assume a beam, which is the same size all over. No, they actually narrowed at the top. So this opinion says that the bottom of the beams were 1 amma by 1.5 amma. However, they went up into a point. And there are 2 interpretations, whether it immediately from the bottom started going up into a slant, and they looked like a sort of like a arrow, or no, that halfway up, the beam was really entirely straight up to about halfway, and then it cut on an angle to a finger breadth's point at the top. In any case, if the beams of the Mishkan at the top narrowed to a finger breadth, so then on one side you may actually have a lavud and a completely covered wagon, but on the other side, where the tops of the wagons are, the tops of the beams are, you actually don't have, you have a lot of space between them and you don't have a covering at all. So Gemara says, but according to the opinion that said that the beams were entirely rectangular all the way up to the top, how are you going to explain that there was an uncovered area in the wagons? Actually, was all covered by the wagons, by the beams. Amar of Kahana, actually, you're forgetting something, and there was a need for the beams rings. So the way they would stabilize the beams in the Mishkan, so you had 20 beams on either side in the length of the Mishkan, each one 1.5 amma. So we're talking about 30 amma. They were 10 amma high. So this would be a highly unstable wall of 20 beams side by side. So they supported it by several structural ways. One, there was a ring at the top of each beam that connected the 2 beams, that was interlocking between the 2 beams. Basically a slit in the wood at the top of one beam and a similar slit in the wood at the top of the other beam, and a ring that went in it that held the beams together. That was one system. Another system of interlocking them was that in front of the beams, there were two rings. So meaning the face of the beam, one side had two rings, one at the top and one towards the bottom. And a central beam would go through those rings along the entire side. And that would stabilize it at the top and the bottom. So this is like a cross beam at the top and bottom of the sides. Now, these beams, in order to handle these, had affixed a ring on them. So up until now, we were calculating beams and whether they were piled on their vertical side, on their wider side or on their narrower side. Either way, we didn't account for the rings. But if you're accounting for the rings, so you actually have to put them on their narrow side. They're taking up 1 amma of the wagon on their narrow side, and you have to pile 3 high on the narrow side, which obviously would again be unstable. So the Gemara says that the way they did that was that they put 2 beams back to back with each other, and the rings were facing outward. So you had 1 ring facing towards the front of the wagon, and 1 beam with the rings facing the center of the wagon, and you had the smooth side of these beams back to back with each other to support each other. And that was the way the beams were piled on these wagons. What results is that you have a full amma of space, or definitely not lavud, of space where the rings are facing each other at the center of the wagon. And therefore, we have an uncovered area in the wagons themselves. At Bayehechem, we would put the rings agaba da agala in the center of the wagon. So where it says, okay, so if your open airspace is in the center of the wagon, the middle amma. So if it's a 5 amma long wagon, so you had first 2 ammas covered by beams, and the last 2 ammas covered by beams, and in the center it was uncovered because you had space. You had to make space for the rings. Well, didn't the wagon have a base, and that in and of itself was a cover, right? If you think of it like a flatbed, so it had the bed, it had the cover itself. The wagon itself should have some cover. So now we turn the page to Tzaddik Chesamit Beis. Amar Shmuel b'Yesedus. Actually, the wagon was not made of didn't have a flat bed. It was just made of pegs, meaning it was made of beams. It was made of let's see, forget this. Yeah, it was made of interlocking beams, sort of like a box. And so it was basically a wood box on wheels. Tana Rabbanan. So now we're going to get into this machlokas about how the Mishkan structure was in these beams that ended, that were narrow, wide, 1.5 by 1 at the bottom, and at the top they went up. They ended in a narrow space. So to explain this next Gemara, we have to understand that the Mishkan, being 20 beams long, which is 30 amma, by 10 amma wide, it also had curtains as their covers, and these curtains were made of panels, each one of them, and there were layers of curtains. So the Gemara is going to look at that, but we essentially have a structural question that if the long side, the length of the Mishkan, has beams that narrow at the top, and they narrow, assumingly, the Gemara is assuming that the inside of the Mishkan was straight up. All you saw was a straight up beam, and the point was on the outer side. So from the inside, it looks like it goes straight up. On the outside, you can see that it narrows towards the top. Well, if you take the long wall to the end, and then you have a corner where the beam against it is also narrow, is going to fill the corner gap. Actually, on the outside, there's going to be an overlap that sticks out, because you have, say, on the north, on the wall that goes from east to west, on the north side, that wall ends against the eastern wall. And when it ends against the eastern wall, and the eastern wall has beams along it, those beams are going to be entirely 1.5 amma wide. But the wall on the north side that goes east-west, that one is not 1.5 amma wide, because at the top of it, it actually is only a finger breadth wide. And so you're going to have an overlap that's sticking out on that corner. And that's a problem the Gemara is going to mention. So the first opinion says that they were 1.5 by 1 wide at the bottom, but at the top they narrowed, and they went up, and they narrowed to a finger's breadth. Shenemar, as it says, as it will come and end at its point, at the top, at the head. It says it ended, it completed. So we see that tam means that it ends, so it goes into a point. Rabbi Yehuda, that's opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. However, he says no, just as at the bottom they were an amma wide, so too at the top it was an amma. Shenemar, as it says, yachdav, together, so they were all the same. So how does he respond to tamim? Vaksiv tamim, ahu the leiser shleim. He says that the tamim means complete, not that it ended there, but it was complete, meaning you can't make a beam out of parts. It has to be a solid piece of wood, one single solid piece of wood, each beam. But not that they were made out of plywood, right? different pieces. V'idach, a Rabbi Yehuda responds, Nami aksev yachtav. What does he do with that? They were yachtav together. That's just to say that they should not slip off from each other. One that they have to be exactly smooth, straight, and not one inward a little more than the other. They have to be plumb and flush. So according to the opinion that says that they were the same size above and below, it says that on the western side of the Mishkan, Tasa Shisha Krushim, you're going to have 6 beams, Ushnei Krushim Tasa Lemiktzos, and 2 in the corners. So you have 6 beams in the center. 6 times 1.5 is going to be the 9 amma in the gap, to fill the gap. But you also have another amma, because the inside of the Mishkan was 10, and the extra amma was in the last beam, half amma on each side, because 1 amma on each of the beams was covered by the northwest, by the north wall that goes east-west, and by the south wall that goes east-west. And each one of those is 1.5 amma long by amma wide. So the amma width would be sitting along the western wall. So you have another 1/2 amma, and those were the beams on the corners. The asi puti dahani memale leo l'simcha dahani, that the width of this beam fills the length of that beam. But according to Rabbi Yehuda, it says that it got narrow at the top. Well, then what would end up happening is that you have this protrusion, because since it gets narrow on the outer side of the Mishkan, and you have the corner piece, the corner beam from the western wall that's against the north wall and against the south wall that go east-west, well, you're going to have that extra protrusion. So Gemara says, actually, that corner beam narrowed on both sides. It narrowed on the north side, narrowed towards the south, and on the western side itself, it also narrowed towards the towards the east, and this way that beam ended sort of in a point, a finger by finger point, which was on the corner itself. So according to Rav Nechemia, the bird's eye view looked completely like you'd imagine bricks laying the tops of the beams. But according to Rav Yehuda, these were all just a very thin line all along. And this is going to bring us to the next question, which is going to be the discussion. Well, not the next one, the following one, which is going to be discussion. How do these curtains sit? According to Rav Nechemia, the curtains filled the 10 by 30 center, the ear space of the Mishkan, but it also had to cover the amma of the width of all the walls. But according to Yehuda, it didn't. If the width of the walls at the top were actually only one finger breadth, so it didn't have to cover that. It started hanging and coming down on the beams immediately after that, and so it didn't have that. It had a longer. It was hanging down longer. In any case, how did this wall stand? So we said that there were the beams that went along the sides, but there was a bariach hatichon, a central beam, and the Gemara is going to tell us a miracle beam that actually went around in U shape through all the beams in the center of the beam, went through all the beams on the north side, through all the beams east-west, all the way to the western wall. Then it turned and went down the western wall from north to south, and then it turned from the western wall into the southern wall, going west-east all the way to the end. And so you had a U-shaped beam, and how do you do that if you have a wood beam going all the way through? In the center of these beams, there was a central pole to hold it stable. And the Brisa says that it was a miracle. Fine. Now we get to the coverings. So the coverings of the Mishkan. So the first layer of covering was called the Mishkan covering. And that, if we make a simple calculation, according to Rabbi Nechemia, the beams are 10 amma high. The ear space in the Mishkan is 10 amma wide. And each side has an amma of the depth of the width of the beam. So you now have a curtain that is 10 amma on the top, plus the two sides, you need 12 amma. And then you need 10 amma on either side. So you would need a 32 amma wide, a 32 amma wide covering to cover it. So this curtain was made of 10 panels. Each individual panel, they were 28 amma long. Now, if you wanted to cover the entire thing, we said, according to Rabbi Nechemia, you would need 30 amma. So, so if you put it, the length of each curtain to the width of the Mishkan, of each panel, because the panels were connected for the entire length. So each panel itself, if you put it along the length of the Mishkan, the width of the Mishkan, kama havia esr. The panel itself was 28. Dal esel igra. 10 of it filled the ear space, the open space of the Mishkan as a ceiling. So that's 10 amos. Pashalu Tesla Haigisa, but Tesla Haigisa. But you also have the 2 amma of the wall itself. So now you have 9 on each side to hang down. Rav Yehuda Migalia Amma Da'adanim. So according to Rav Yehuda, 1 amma of the base. Each one of these beams sat in a base that was basically like a shoe. Each beam had 2 protrusions at the bottom, 2 legs, let's call it, at the bottom, and there were shoes to stabilize it. So each one stood in those, and according to Rabbi Yehuda, where there was no depth of the beam at the top, so all you could see at the bottom was the 1 amma of this base. of the shoe. However, Rabbi Nechemia Megalia Amma the Krushim, but according to Rabbi Nechemia, it only went down 8 amma on each side, because you had the 10 in the center, and on top of that, you also had 1 amma on each side for the depth of the wall. So all you were left with was 8 on each side. So you saw 1 amma of the copper base and another amma of the gold beam, and then the rest was covered. So Matzah Shabbos will continue with explaining the curtains according to Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nechemia.